Hey there, folks. So I watched this debate between Tilly Middlehurst, wow, that is one British name, and a manosphere whack job named Cooley, and oh boy, do I have so much to say. So before anything else, let me get my biases and philosophical background out of the way so you know exactly where I am coming from. I am an analytic moral skeptic, a moral nihilist, and an egoist anarchist influenced by the likes of Max Stirner, David Hume, J.L. Mackie, and other amoral philosophers. Because I take philosophy seriously, this debate had me screaming. And to be clear here, I do like Tilly and I do hate guys like Cooley. If you look at my YouTube channel, at least at the time of uploading, the overwhelming amount of my content is aimed at attacking the political right with barely any focus on the left. As an egoist, I see the right as being directly opposed to my self-interest in what I prioritize, which is freedom and bodily autonomy. So naturally, a lot of my goals align with Tilly and the political left. I covered her debate with Charlie Kirk before, and she did pretty well. She did go viral for a good reason. But watching her in this debate, I it was disappointing to say the least. The way she formulated her arguments, the philosophical incoherence, the constant flipping between contradictory frameworks almost every single sentence, and I'm barely being hyperbolic here, was actually insane. This isn't meant to be one of my more jokey breakdowns like I've done in the past. This is me taking my frustration with Tilly's reasoning seriously, albeit with a bit of humor sprinkled in. And for Tilly or any of her fans who might be watching, this is not meant as an attack on her as a person. These critiques aren't even exclusive to her. Secular morality in general is notoriously incoherent, impossible to properly ground, and usually collapses into mere preference. The goal here is for both her and her audience to get something useful out of this, so maybe she can formulate her arguments more coherently next time. There is a lot to go over, and I'm not going to cover the entire debate word for word, I'll be cutting out failure, but all of the unique points will be addressed. With that intro out of the way, if you like what you see, subscribe and all of that stuff, and let's get to it.
There are three reasons why Cooley's crude interpretation of pop philosophy that he calls force doctrine falls apart. Firstly, something to understand that Cooley doesn't understand is that he has to be good at arguing for socially constructed rights. But I will argue that rights exist as good features of social arrangements, and I'm going to ground this in contractarianism. I could grant Cooley the entire supposed internal critique of force doctrine, but if I can demonstrate why rights are not granted but simply exist, then there is no contradiction inherent to feminism at all, and patriarchy is therefore not necessary but limiting. Why is this? Because rights aren't physical things you can point to, sure, nor are they subjective opinions or socially constructed preferences, though. They are normative facts about the rules of mutual restraint that any rational equal agent would accept. Rights are derived from the logic of cooperation, which means not from feelings or the state or whoever is the strongest. They come from what's rationally required for people who share a world to coexist without domination. That means they exist regardless of male enforcement classes or not. Male enforcement is one arm of realization of rights that exist regardless of whether or not men are quote unquote benevolent for not violating them some of the time.
Alright, we're only about 30 seconds into Tilly's opener, and she's already juggling more contradictory philosophical commitments than I knew one person could fit into a paragraph. She starts by saying Cooley has to argue for socially constructed rights, and then immediately turns around and says rights exist as good features of social arrangements, which, newsflash, are themselves social constructs. She then claims she's grounding this in contractarianism, except contractarianism is explicitly a mind-dependent framework where rights are constructed through agreement, not metaphysical entities floating in the void. But she insists rights are not granted, they simply exist. That is moral realism. She has now claimed realism and constructivism within two sentences. Then we get rights aren't physical things that you could point to, but they're somehow also not subjective opinions and somehow not socially constructed preferences either. She has eliminated every possible category of grounding without offering a replacement. So let me drop a quick analytic distinction here because this is where the wheels completely fall off. Bertrand Russell, one of the main figures of analytic philosophy, points out that all human knowledge comes through either knowledge by acquaintance, direct sensory awareness, or knowledge by description, which is information derived from other minds. You're watching me right now via acquaintance, But if I tell you Trump bombed some Venezuelan drug boat, and you learn that from a headline, that's knowledge by description. Everything we know uses one of these two pipelines. But Tilly wants rights to be objective, mind dependent normative facts, while also admitting we cannot be acquainted with them physically, conceptually, or phenomenal, and also denying they're accessible through description because that would make them socially dependent. She has created an entity that cannot be known by acquaintance or description, which means by her own logic there is no possible way to know these rights exist or what they contain. And then, despite calling them mind-independent facts, she says that they are derived from the logic of cooperation. Cooperation is a human, mind-dependent process. That's contractarianism again, from Rawls, Gauthier, Hobbes, all of whom deny the existence of mind-independent moral facts. Hobbes literally says, covenants without the sword are but words, meaning rights do not exist without enforcement. But she claims rights exist regardless of enforcement, regardless of minds, regardless of social construction, while also being features of social arrangements and derived from cooperation. This isn't one argument. It is four incompatible ontologies colliding at one: moral realism, constructivism, contractarianism, and Kantian constitutivism. She then says rights derive from what is rationally required for people who share a world to coexist without domination. Again, that is a direct contradiction of contractarianism. Contractarianism is grounded in bargaining, mutual advantage, and constructed cooperation, not in some universal rational necessity or moral realism. She keeps mixing frameworks like they are interchangeable. And finally, she wraps up point one by claiming rights exist regardless of male enforcement classes, and that male enforcement is merely one arm of realizing rights. If we're talking about rights in the only coherent, historically grounded sense, rights as state granted privileges enforced through institutions, then I don't inherently disagree that enforcement is one mode of realizing them. Historically speaking, almost every state has been patriarchal, and the enforcement of rights has overwhelmingly been carried out by male institutions. That's just history. But in principle, if you define rights as state granted privileges, then yes, enforcement is one way they're realized. That doesn't salvage her argument. It just means she's occasionally stumbling into the correct conclusion for the wrong reasons. And with that, we can finally move into point number two.
Secondly, feminism begins with the enforcement of the social contract by extending the right to be protected from arbitrary domination interpersonally to women as well as men. But it extends beyond this to erode negative cultural norms as well. Those norms are matters of social preference, not objective rights, and their transformation does not depend on male enforcement. Because actually, male enforcement is the weakest apparatus for enforcing feminist progress. Just like I can't put a gun to anyone's head to make them believe in God, nor can you throw a man in jail to make him view women as human people deserving of social protection from arbitrary force.
Now we're on to point two. She says feminism begins with the enforcement of the social contract by extending the right to be protected from domination to both men and women. And honestly, I don't necessarily disagree with that. That's just how a state functions in practice for any ideology. It enforces rules, protections, regulations, whatever. So far, this is fine. She says feminism also works to erode negative cultural norms. Again, I don't inherently disagree, that's what states do. But what counts as a negative cultural norm is entirely subjective and ultimately up to the state. We've had plenty of states throughout history: Nazi Germany, Maoist and Z-era China, the Roman Empire, that eroded norms they didn't like and replaced them with even worse ones. This is not an argument for objectivity. It's just how state power works. She calls these norms matters of social preference, which I agree with. But then she contrasts that with the so-called objective rights she claims exist. And as we covered in point one, she never actually proved any kind of objectivity. She just declared it. On top of that, for about 98% of recorded history, no state on Earth enforced anything remotely resembling these objective rights she's talking about. These rights only entered mainstream political consciousness maybe 100 years ago, and even then only in the Western world. so calling them objective is historically and philosophically indefensible. Then she says the transformation of these norms isn't dependent on male enforcement because men are the weakest apparatus for enforcing feminist progress. The issue here, and I really want to highlight that I'm not defending patriarchy, I'm just pointing to historical fact, is that literally all feminist progress has occurred under patriarchal systems. Because patriarchal systems are what have dominated global governance for basically the entirety of the state's existence. That is not a justification, that's just the material reality that she's ignoring. She finishes this part by saying you can't force someone to change their mind and gives an analogy. I don't really take an issue with that analogy, to be honest, and with that, we can move on to point number 3.
Thirdly, even if I grant that male physical prowess matters here whatsoever to justify patriarchy, it just demonstrates that Cooley too is in danger from men stronger than him. Civilization requires that we collectively opt into a contract to choose to respect each other's property rights even when we could defile them, that we choose not to take another's life even if we could take it. Therefore, if Cooley tries to express that men kindly grant women rights by not interpersonally violating them, and that therefore patriarchy is a necessary good, then he also has to concede that Chris Bumstead and Mike Tyson kindly grant him his rights by not interpersonally violating him. This is why force doctrine is a rapist's mentality. It is why men feel emasculated when I put force doctrine to them in these terms, because suddenly they can start grounding rights somewhere. They can start producing inherent rights from thin air. So I can explain my position as to why patriarchy is a bad thing for women, but I think that first I can just define a couple of terms since I have about a minute left.
I honestly don't really disagree with anything said here, or at least not anything worth going into. However, where we need to do a deep dive is her terms she defines.
So I can define feminism as the extension of the social contract to include women as full contracting agents, eliminating interpersonal arbitrary domination and ensuring like a cooperative equality. A state, therefore, is an institutional system with a monopoly on legitimate force. I think this is quite intuitive. And crucially, therefore, the state is not inherently male or patriarchal. It is a practical enforcement mechanism for rights-based cooperation, which includes lawyers, a police force, politicians, bureaucrats, and others. So all that force doctrine essentially proves is that society exists. Hence, I can show why patriarchy is bad principally once we grant all of this. Like, we can do practical arguments too, but I would really want to get this principle out of the way first, because I would say that patriarchy is bad, primarily because it blurs interpersonal private force with public force, because it rejects the core principles that create good civilization, i.e. the restraint of private force. I can end the opener here.
From about 4 minutes and 4 seconds to 4 minutes and 51 seconds, she finishes her opener by defining feminism as the extension of the social contract to include women as full contracting agents, eliminating interpersonal arbitrary domination and ensuring cooperative equality. I don't entirely disagree with the concept here, because that is essentially how feminism plays out in practice, but this definition is padded, overly academic, and clearly designed to sound more impressive than it actually is. If you strip away the verbosity, the definition is simply feminism as the ideology supporting equal freedoms for men and women. That's it. She then defines the state as an institutional system with a monopoly on legitimate force, which I actually do agree with as an anarchist. But this is where her earlier claims come back to bite her. Back in point 1, she says rights come from what's rationally required for people to coexist without domination. Yet the entire point of the state is domination. By her own definition, the state is the one entity allowed to legally impose whatever it wants on the population, whether it's a feminist democracy or North Korea. So she wants a world free from domination while openly supporting the one institution that has near total domination built into its structure. Finally, she says patriarchy is bad because it blurs interpersonal private force with public force. Tilly, that is not patriarchy, that is capitalism, especially state capitalism. Patriarchy simply means systems and institutions in which men disproportionately hold power. This definition she gives doesn't connect to any established feminist theory. And that's where she ends her opener. Now we can look at coolies.
Is patriarchy necessary and good for society? I take the affirmative position, and it's ironic because my opponent takes the non-affirmative position, and she's a proud, self-proclaimed feminist, but isn't aware that feminism appeals to patriarchal systems to enforce the mental constructs, also known as rights, that she has in her mind. A patriarchy is necessary because it's inevitable if you want a society, and a society is an aggregate of people in an ordered community. Well, how do you create order, one might ask? It's by enforcement of rules, laws, and rights, and men have the monopoly of force to enforce said laws and rights. A society without order is chaos, so women would have to appeal to a collection of men to enforce their rights, but men aren't afforded the same privilege of having women to enforce their rights.
After seeing this section alone, I can already tell I'm going to have a lot less to say about Cooley, because his arguments are so simplistic that it takes about 8 seconds to dismantle them. So let's just stop right here in the first minute of his opening. No, Cooley, you do not need to appeal to patriarchal systems to enforce feminism. That's just what has happened historically under state civilizations. But feminism, under any academic definition, meaning equal freedom for both men and women, has existed throughout most of human history in egalitarian societies long before states even emerged. The dynamic he is describing is a recent phenomenon tied to the rise of hierarchical states, not something universal about human societies. A patriarchy is also not inevitable if you want a society. Anthropology overwhelmingly shows the opposite. There have been countless large, long-lasting, non-patriarchal, non-hierarchical societies. So, I'm gonna be honest, there really isn't much else to say here besides the fact that this dude is a bozo. Honestly, the rest of his opening is short and repetitive, but he opens with the question asking Tilly if morality is subjective.
Do you believe that morality is subjective?
No, I believe that there are certain rights that we ground in social contractarianism, which is outside of and or mind independent. So, for example, as I outlined in my opening speech, feminists do a couple of things. The first thing they might do is enforce objective rights that are basically mind independent logical phenomena that any rational agent would agree helps people live and coexist in society without dominating one another. So that's an objective thing, for example, the right to life. What I would say is subjective, i.e. like preference-based, are fighting against certain cultural norms that feminists view as negative, and that doesn't require an enforcement class.
Okay, now Tilly contradicts herself in the exact same sentence right out the gate. She says morality isn't subjective and then immediately says it's grounded in contractarianism. Tilly, contractarianism is not objective morality. It is a framework for how moral norms are constructed or enforced, not an argument for mind-independent moral facts. That is a complete non sequitur. Contractarianism doesn't give you one universal moral code, it explains why different societies develop different norms in the first place, which contradicts her claims that there is a single set of objective rights. Then she says feminists enforce objective rights, which are mind-independent logical phenomena. That is another contradiction. Logical phenomena do not exist independent of the mind. Logic is not a physical feature of the universe, it is a cognitive framework. You can't point to logic particles in nature, and even if we grant her rational agent talk, it still doesn't prove objectivity, because plenty of horrifying societies were built by quote-unquote rational agents. Genghis Khan was a rational agent. Stalin was a rational agent. Rationality doesn't magically create objective moral truth. And then she says the right to life is objective, but by what metric? If a right is objective, it should hold universally across cultures. Yet countless societies throughout history have violated that supposed right because they didn't believe it existed in the first place. So what standard is she appealing to here? She never provides one. Then she draws a line between objective rights and subjective preference-based cultural norms that feminists fight against. So let me get this straight. If someone disagrees with her about what qualifies as a right, they're just wrong automatically, Based on what? She's grounding this entire claim in metaethical contractarianism, which doesn't even claim objectivity in its own nature. She's trying to smuggle moral realism into a framework that explicitly does not deliver moral realism, and is just hoping nobody notices the contradiction. Cooley basically goes on to say what I said, except more dumb, with a Mike Tyson analogy, and I don't really need to include all of that. And I believe for a lot of this first half of this debate as well, Cooley's just going to be primarily asking questions, since Tilly has a lot of explaining to do. So before we get into it, let me show you what that actually looks like with a quick little funny skit. And you'll see in a second why I am not exaggerating with what you're about to see. Tilly, before we go on, can you define a right? Yes, a right is... I'm sorry, I don't think I can understand you. What the hell is a right? Okay. A right is... Hang on a second, I wrote it down somewhere. Ah, here you go. Tilly, what the hell is this? That is, the definition of a right. This is a word salad. I asked for a simple definition. Okay, listen. I'm not the smartest guy in the world. Like, for Christ's sake, I dropped out of middle school. I'm sorry. I meant I only graduated high school. Can you please just simplify it? Okay, so, let me ask you this. What is 2 plus 2? 4? And that's why rights exist objectively. What the fuck? So we can move on to her responding to him, asking how she grounds any morality.
So you're not really like mapping this onto anything. You're just like saying words, but it doesn't really hold any weight. How do you ground morality? Please explain.
Right, I'll ask you a really simple question then, which is 2 plus 2 4, whether or not you are on Mars or on Earth? Like, let's say every human being disappears from society. Is 2 plus 2 still 4?
That is true.
Right. So that's where I ground rights.
As I was typing this part of the script, I legitimately yelled out, "What?" when I heard her say this. She literally argues, math, therefore I'm correct. That is yet another massive category error. Math is demonstrable and its truth is limited to its own framework. 2 plus 2 equals 4 is valid within the relational structure of mathematics, but is not some floating mind-independent truth embedded in the fabric of Mars waiting for somebody to notice it. Math is a framework, not a physical object. And to explain what I mean by that, let me bring in David Hume, the grandfather of modern science, the guy who perfected empiricism and made Immanuel Kant rethink his entire career, and is arguably the most important philosopher of the last 500 years. Hume's fork divides all knowledge claims into 2 categories: relations of ideas and matters of fact. Relations of ideas are everything that exists in the mind: math, logic, moral language, conceptual categories, definitions, and so on. Matters of fact describe the physical world, the screen you're watching on, the existence of rocks, planets, chairs, whatever. Math lies squarely in the relations of ideas side, even if we could demonstrate it with real-world objects. But morality does not function like math. Morality has no external demonstration. You can't point at a moral truth in physical space. At best, you can point to human suffering and say, that makes me feel bad. But that's not objectivity, that's emotion. And for reasons I've already outlined, none of this gets her any closer to proving objective morality or objective rights. She's smuggling moral realism in under the guise of math, and the analogy just doesn't hold.
Okay, could you go ahead, Cooley, and redefine your definition of rights because I missed it?
Okay, yeah. So I think that rights is a construct of the mind. So rights is a construct of the mind. We, formulate these do's and don'ts in our mind, and then men enforce those rights. A collection of men enforce those rights. So rights is just a construct of the mind.
Okay.
Remember when I said there's not much more I can say regarding Cooley? Yeah. What the hell are you... What are you supposed to even do with this? He says rights are constructs of the mind and the do's and don'ts in our head. First of all, that latter part is just called morality. Second, if rights are literally anything that exists in your imagination, then I guess the mental construct of Sydney Sweeney in denim jeans is also a right now. Like, where do you even go with that? If a mental picture counts as a right, then its definition collapses instantly. There's nothing serious to analyze here. So let's switch back to Tilly, who at least says things I can actually respond to. Holy shit.
I would say that rights are the minimal set of claims that each rational agent has to be able to make over themselves and over the world in order for a social contract to be possible, i.e. society.
Thankfully, she kept it short this time. But breaking down that definition though, did Jews under Nazi Germany have rights? Did anyone Vlad the Impaler impaled have rights? What about the people living under colonial America? You can say rights are claims rational agents need to make for social contracts to be possible. But Tilly, most of human civilization in the past several millennia was literally built on slavery until extremely recently, and in many places it still is. Those societies had functioning social contracts, however brutal, without anything resembling the rights you're talking about. So even if we fully accept her definition on its own terms, it's still provably false. History is one big counterexample to this. Then there is some pointless filler dialogue going on, but then Tilly makes a very embarrassing slip up.
I'm asking that question. So you define rights as repeat it again, actually, because it's so ambiguous. It's like
It's
hard,
ambiguous.
or maybe I'm just slow. Repeat it again. You're in what is it? Cambridge University.
Yeah.
All right, fair enough. I don't. I just have a high school education. Repeat it again for me.
So I say that rights are the hold on. I wrote the definition down myself.
She actually had to tell the entire audience, hold on, I wrote this down somewhere. Just to restate the definition she gave less than a minute earlier. I am sorry, but that is rough. Taking notes into a debate is totally normal. I even have my own notes right now. But having to read off your notes for something as basic and pivotal as your own definition of rights, especially a definition that's already ambiguous and philosophically shaky, is just a bad look. And coming from someone trained in debate at a supposedly elite institution like Cambridge, it really undercuts the aura of the academic authority she is trying to project.
Well, one, let's just ask this. Are you atheist or are you religious?
Atheist.
Okay, so you're an atheist and you're grounding morality in logic. So if I'm a logical rational being, you're a logical rational being, and there's many people that kill people for a living and commit all of these mass murders. You're saying that they don't operate logically?
Yep.
They
Or
don't-
at
okay.
least like the logic that grounds like the correct way in which for agents to act rationally in society is like wrong. This is not to
Okay,
say
what
that
about
the
women?
reason why
Okay,
people
so what
commit
about
murders is
women?
they're illogical.
Okay, so what about women that abort their children? And
Yeah,
they do
I
it.
think
They do
that-
it. They do it for reasons where it's like, I slept with the wrong person. I'm going to go ahead and abort this baby. It's not for reasons like rape or like her life is in jeopardy. It's for a reason like, I slept with the wrong person. I don't think that he's the one, and I don't want to have his kid. I'm aborting this child. Do you think that women should have that right to do that?
Yeah, I think that falls under the right to bodily autonomy.
And you would think that that's morally good.
It's morally good that they have that right realized. Yeah.
Okay, so it is morally good that women abort their children just for how they feel. But once again, where are you grounding it good in? You're not
Right,
you're grounded. It's subjective, Tilly. You believe in
No, that the
subjective
rational
morality.
condition-
And finally, Cooley actually makes a halfway decent point. He presses her on something real. If you're an atheist, what exactly grounds your morality? And he does it by giving examples, like how she says murder is irrational, but abortion, one done for personal reasons, is rational. I'm not going to replay the whole exchange here, but it is worth watching. The key thing is, he finally forces her to explain how her moral framework cashes out in real decisions. And this is where things get interesting.
Agency requires exclusive authority over your own body. Like, there are rational conditions that are prerequisites for agency, and those things can be like concluded rationally.
Okay, so as long as it's rational, let's just use your argument and let's see if it makes sense. As long as something is rational, then it's good? If it's rational and logical, then it's good.
No, because I'm saying that if a rational agent doesn't have certain authority about whether or not their own internal bodily processes, then they don't have like bodily autonomy. Okay, so I'm not saying as long as you can logically justify something in a logically watertight way, that automatically makes it something that is a really good thing. Like, there are a bunch of things that maybe I could logically get to that you might have objections to.
So Tilly is not objective.
She says exclusive authority over one's own body is the prerequisite for agency. Okay, and she presents agency in self as inherently good. But when Cooley pushes her to actually follow through on that logic, okay, so what makes something good? Is it rationally automatically good? She suddenly ramps up her speaking speed into a completely different gear. This is the fastest she's talked in the entire debate up to this point. And if you understand why people switch into rapid-fire speech under argumentative pressure, it's obvious what is happening. She is shifting into defensive rhetorical overdrive. She starts stacking caveats, layering distinctions, and throwing conceptual smoke bombs to cover the very real gap Cooley just exposed in her grounding. And I'm not going to sugarcoat it. This is a full logical implosion of her framework. Her original meta-ethics cannot stand the question he asked. And instead of defending it, she pivots into an entirely different grounding. Now the topic shifts to agency, basically just retreading the same ground again. You know what? Let's just use a second skit to demonstrate that point. Tilly, if we take your argument to its conclusion, anything rational is good. Is that correct? No, but here's another wood salad about why I like agency. Okay, but have you considered I can rationally kill you? What the fuck?
Yeah, it would remove my agency using physical.
I can do it in a rational way by setting up a plan to kill you.
Consider this the abridged version of what's happening during this portion, but Cooley dropping "I could rationally plan to kill you" actually got a laugh out of me. They just keep looping the same argument with slightly different reasoning for a large portion of the next sections, so no need to cover old ground. So let's just move on to the next part where a new point is made.
I seen you post something and you said that, well, forced doctrine is might makes right. I said that forced doctrine isn't might makes right. You did say this. You said this. You posted this. That's basically what you said. So I believe that's what you think. But you can correct me.
Feminism that demonstrates why feminism falls in on itself due to the fact that women appeal to men for an enforcement class. Is forced doctrine might makes right? Is that what you believe or no? Not necessarily, but it oftentimes does collapse into that, especially because your understanding of force ultimately does demonstrate that might makes right to you. So the force doctrine itself, no, it's probably not might makes right, but your ideological belief system is probably that might makes right.
Okay. And
this is probably justify patriarchy.
My ideology isn't that might makes right, because I don't appeal to what's in my mind. I appeal to what's outside of my mind.
I actually want to slow down for this part because Tilly actually says something correct here. Even if these bozos swear up and down that force doctrine isn't might makes right, in practice it literally is. The entire debate is Cooley trying to justify patriarchy, and the only mechanism he has for enforcing it is, surprise, force doctrine. Under his worldview, might doesn't just make reality, it makes morality. And when he claims he's appealing to something outside the mind, what exactly is he appealing to? Because nothing outside of the mind indicates patriarchy is good or desirable. It is a system that disproportionately hands power to half the population and lets them make biased decisions at the expense of the other half, Whether it's abortion rights, which Cooley can't ground in anything mind independent, the gender pay gap, or trad wife gender roles, where women who don't want to be full-time housekeepers get socially punished. There is no external mind independent evidence that patriarchy is morally good. It's just Cooley's preferences dressed up as metaphysics.
A person who has been kidnapped has the right to not be kidnapped, to not be enslaved, but the person has taken away their right to be enslaved.
Okay, so they have that. Okay, so they have that right. And where would this right lie in? Would it just lie in their mind?
No.
Where would it be grounded in?
The social contract.
Okay, if it's a social construct that people collectively agree that, okay, we agree that, grape is bad. We collectively agree to that. So then, say if the collective of people agree that grape is good.
Yeah, this is why I'm saying that my morality is not preference-based. Because let's say you have...
This would mean that it is preference-based, Tilly.
No, because it means that
if you're appealing to people...
I'll tell you why grape is wrong from an objective standpoint, following the logic of Hobbes and Locke and Rousseau and people from hundreds of years ago where this argument has already been put to bed, okay?
Okay, so you're going to utilize harm principle then?
No. Absolute force leads to instability and constant threat, okay? No group benefits from living in perpetual conflict. Rational agents, rational people, prefer legitimate, predictable rules enforced by neutral institutions, okay? So because of the fact that, as Rousseau has put it, force doesn't create obligation, duty arises when individuals consent to a collective order that secures their freedom. That is called society, that is called civilization. And this is why grape is bad, because it flouts that contract of civilization.
Restating the fact that social contracts don't exist independently of the minds of the people in a society aside, Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau are not the guys she wants to be citing here. Hobbes was a subjectivist. We already covered him when we talked about contractarianism. Locke was a Christian who believed morality came from God, which would actually put him closer to Cooley's worldview than hers. And Rousseau was a social contract constructivist, which is the polar opposite of moral objectivism. She claimed Rousseau said that force doesn't create obligation, and duty arises when individuals consent to a collective power that secures their freedom. But that is not what Rousseau said. What he actually said was that the strongest is never strong enough to be always the master, until he transforms strength into right, and obedience into duty. The first half is fine. Force alone doesn't create moral authority, but the rest of what she added about duty and collective order securing freedom is something she invented. It's not Rousseau, it's her own framework wearing a Rousseau mask.
Okay, but what if...
it makes me feel bad.
Okay, but what if a group of people, like they make the society, but they actually agree? Like, for example, you ever heard of an island called Papua New Guinea? Mm-hmm. It's a tribe, this island, right? And you heard of that. And basically, as a rite of passage, these kids have to do oral acts to the warriors. And that, under their worldview, right? That's good. So, like pedophiles, they're doing these things to children, and these children are doing these things to adult men. So, if they all agree to that. Is that good since they all agree to that and that's this society that they built? Is that good?
No.
Okay. Can you demonstrate then how it is not good if you just said a second ago that basically you have a right because a collection of people agreed to this?
That's not why I said you have a right.
I'm sorry. You said that it's good because a collection of people agreed to it.
No, I'm saying society happens when people collectively agree, or good society happens, as in effective society happens when like a legitimate order emerges, right? And a legitimate order, what that looks like is when people choose restraint, people choose to reject arbitrary force and domination onto others, like where restraint is a feature of the social contract. So no, I'm not just saying that like grape is bad because, or grape is good because of people agreeing or disagreeing to do it, right? I'm saying that your internal critique fails because you are mistaking things like universal social contract dynamics or things that require society to work for male enforcement, right? But feminism depends on the same cooperative structures that underpin literally any legitimate political order. It's called society.
She basically just dodges the question here. You can tell she realizes her entire framework implodes once you point to a society that does some, let's say, nasty shit, but still functions just fine. Her response is to repeat her earlier talking points and pretend the example isn't relevant, ignoring the fact that places like Papua New Guinea restrain themselves just enough to avoid societal collapse, while still doing things virtually all of us would find abhorrent. That directly violates her entire metaethical foundation. If rational, stable societies can exist while committing horrific acts, then under her own logic, those acts would count as morally good, simply because they don't destroy the social contract. She won't address that, and she doesn't address that. She just sidesteps it and moves on, because the example blows a hole straight through the base of her argument. The next session is just them arguing about whether stepping in to stop Papua New Guinea rituals would count as forced doctrine or not. Honestly, Tilly actually holds up fine here. I would say pretty good even. When they move away from metaethics and into political theory, she does a lot better. We saw the same thing in her debate with Charlie Kirk. Cooley keeps trying to argue that patriarchy is the only way to prevent abuse. Tilly adds nuance, then it slips into retreading ground on what patriarchy is and who holds power. Then they go into morality being objective again, nothing new is happening philosophically, it's just the same argument wearing a different coat. So I'm not going to waste your time breaking down what we have heard before. And honestly, there really isn't actually much else to say after this point. Everything past here just retreads old ground, and I'm not going to make a 4-hour video breaking down every syllable of this debate. So let's wrap it up with a quick summary. As I said at the beginning, I don't think Tilly is dumb. When the debate moved into her strong area, political theory, she looked genuinely good. But when it shifted to philosophy, that is when everything became completely incoherent. And I've seen a lot of comments on Tilly's, Destiny's, and Cooley's uploads saying she won, and I think I do understand why. She sounds smart. Combine an academic background, confident fast talking, a heavy dose of jargon, and a British accent, and people will eat that up even if none of it actually holds up under scrutiny. But once you slow down and actually analyze her claims, her opening is full of contradictions. She walks back her positions multiple times. It's just that nobody notices because philosophy is complex, and most people, including Tilly, don't really know how to navigate it. That's why I wanted to put this debate under a microscope and explain the flaws in a way that's actually digestible. It's also the direction I kind of want my channel to go, moving away from the low-quality TikTok debates and moving towards analyzing people who are, at the very least, interesting to break down. And Tilly, if you made it this far, I'm totally down to talk more, either publicly or privately. I've seen you chat with smaller channels before, so just know the door is open. And you're also free to react to this video on a live stream or an upload or whatever. Just give me credit in the description is all. And other than that, that's really all I got. Thanks for watching this far. My Discord server's open if you want to discuss this more. And stick around because I've got more debate breakdowns coming, both fun ones and more serious academic ones. Peace.